When Omar Griffiths loaned Anthony Hamilton $2,000 for his son's racing equipment in 1994, he never expected anything in return. It was just one of many small kindnesses the Stevenage shop owner offered to a father determined to support his son's racing dreams. 29 years later, as seven-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton celebrates another victory, Omar stares at an eviction notice in his trembling hands. His racing supply shop is gone, his health is failing, and at 68, with early Parkinson's disease making his hands shake, he has nowhere to go. The man who once helped launch the career of Britain's greatest racing driver now faces homelessness, forgotten by the sport he devoted his life to and the champion he once believed in. Omar Griffiths wiped his hands on an old rag and squinted at the letter again. The words hadn't changed since 5 minutes ago when he first opened it. Final notice of eviction. The paper trembled in his fingers. 30 years in this shop, and now they were giving him 30 days to leave. Omar sank onto the wooden stool. Behind the counter, his legs suddenly too weak to hold him up. The bell above the door jingled, and Omar quickly stuffed the letter into his pocket. No need to scare away customers with his troubles. "Morning, Mr. Griffiths." Maya, a 12-year-old kart racer, bounded into the shop with her father trailing behind. "Got those gloves I ordered?" Omar forced a smile. "Just came in yesterday. Love." He pulled a box from beneath the counter. "Try them on. Make sure they fit right." While Maya tried on the gloves, Omar's mind drifted back to another eager young racer who used to visit his shop. It was 1994, and business was booming then. Griffiths Racing Supplies was the only proper racing shop in Stevenage. The boy had been small for 9, with wide eyes that took in everything: the helmets, the racing suits, the kart parts hanging on the walls. But unlike Maya's father, who could afford new gloves without blinking, that boy's father had counted every penny. "They're perfect." Maya's voice yanked Omar back to the present. After they left, Omar locked the shop door and climbed the narrow stairs to his flat above. The rooms were small, but filled with racing memories. Trophies from his own amateur racing days, signed, photos, and newspaper clippings. His favorite was framed on the wall beside his armchair. A photo of a skinny 9-year-old boy standing proudly beside his cart, grinning from ear to ear. Lewis Hamilton, now a 7-time Formula One world champion. Omar touched the frame gently. "Look at you now, lad," he murmured. He remembered the day Anthony Hamilton had come into the shop, looking worried. Anthony was working 3 jobs then, trying to keep food on the table while also funding his son's racing dreams. "The championship's next weekend," Anthony had explained, "but Lewis's cart needs new tires and a clutch. I don't get paid until the end of the month." Omar had known what was coming. It wasn't the first time a parent had asked for credit. Racing wasn't cheap, and dreams were expensive. "How much do you need?" Omar had asked. Anthony named a figure: £2,000. Far more than Omar usually advanced to customers. "That's a lot," Omar had said, watching Anthony's face fall. "But that boy of yours, he's something special, isn't he?" "He is," Anthony had replied with quiet certainty. "He really is." Omar had gone to his cash box and counted out the money. "Pay me back when you can," he'd said, writing up a simple receipt. No interest, no deadline. Just a handshake between 2 men who believed in a boy's dream. Now, 29 years later, Omar opened his refrigerator and sighed at its nearly empty shelves. The shop barely made enough to cover costs these days. Online retailers had killed most of his business. The big chains took care of the rest. His fingers brushed against the eviction notice in his pocket. Where would he go? At 68, with trembling hands that the doctor said was early Parkinson's, who would hire him? His gaze drifted to an old racing magazine on the coffee table. Lewis Hamilton's face smiled from the cover, champagne spraying around him as he celebrated another victory. That loan to Anthony had been the first of several. Omar had given discounts on equipment, extended credit when needed, even paid for Lewis's entry fee for a crucial race when Anthony came up short. Not that Lewis would remember. Why would he? To Lewis, Omar was probably just one of many who'd helped along the way, if he remembered him at all. Omar had never asked for anything in return. He'd made the loans because he believed in talent, because he'd seen something in that boy's eyes, a hunger, a focus, a gift, the same gift Omar himself had lacked in his own brief racing career. The phone rang, startling him. It was his landlord. "Did you get my letter?" Mr. Patel didn't wait for an answer. "The building's been sold to developers. They're turning the whole block into luxury flats." "But I've been here 30 years, Omar protested. "Surely there's something." 30 years of barely making rent on time," Mr. Patel cut in. "I've been patient, Omar. More patient than most. Landlords would be. But it's done now." After hanging up, Omar pulled out his medication. The small pills that helped control the tremors cost more than he could really afford, but without them, he couldn't work at all. That night, he dreamed of racetracks and cheering crowds, of a small boy standing on a milk crate to reach the pedals of a go-kart, of Anthony Hamilton's determined face as he counted out loan repayments, £5 at a time, over many months. In the morning, Omar stood in his shop surrounded by helmets, racing suits, and parts. Stock he could no longer sell. Dreams he could no longer afford to finance. The world had moved on, leaving him behind, just as it had passed by so many others who'd helped young talents on their way up. He picked up a small trophy from beneath the counter. Lewis's first win at the Rye House Kart Circuit. Anthony had given it to Omar as a thank you. "Without you, he wouldn't even have been on the grid," Anthony had said. Omar placed it carefully back under the counter. Helping Lewis had been one of the best things he'd ever done. He couldn't regret it, even now. The eviction notice lay on the counter, the deadline circled in red. 30 days to find a new home, a new beginning. At 68, with trembling hands and empty pockets, Omar flipped the sign on the door to open and straightened his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he had helped a champion begin his journey. That was something no eviction notice could take away. The morning dragged by without a single customer. Omar busied himself taking inventory. Not that it mattered much now. At noon, he made himself a cup of tea and unwrapped a sandwich he'd brought from upstairs. As he ate, he let his mind drift back to 1995. Lewis Hamilton had just turned 10, and Omar had never seen a kid so focused. While other boys his age played football or video games, Lewis spent hours at the Rye House Kart Circuit. It was a cold April day when Omar drove to Rye House to watch Lewis race. He hadn't told Anthony he was coming. He just wanted to see if his investment was worthwhile. The track was busy with young racers and their families. Most had fancy trailers and equipment. Anthony's old van looked out of place among them. Omar spotted Lewis right away. The boy was checking his cart by himself while Anthony talked to an official. Even from a distance, Omar could see the worry on Anthony's face. "Everything all right?" Omar asked, walking up. Anthony looked surprised to see him. "Clutch is slipping again. We fixed it last night, but..." Lewis looked up from his cart. "I can still win," he said firmly. It just means I have to be perfect at the start. Omar smiled at the boy's confidence. Mind if I take a look? Together, they bent over the cart. The clutch wasn't just slipping. It was about to fail completely. Omar had brought some tools, just in case, and he had a spare clutch in his car. I can't accept more help, Anthony said when Omar offered. I still haven't paid back the last loan. Consider it an investment, Omar replied. If he wins today, your boy moves up the rankings, right? More people will notice him. They fixed the cart just in time for Lewis's heat. The boy lined up at the back of the grid. His qualifying time had been poor because of the clutch problem. Watch this, Anthony said with quiet pride. From last place, Lewis moved through the field like water finding its path downhill. Where other drivers hesitated, he committed. Where they saw walls, he found openings. By the halfway point, he was in third. He's special, Omar murmured, almost to himself. Anthony nodded. I know. He hesitated, then added, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, though. The money. Omar understood. Racing consumed money like a fire consumed oxygen. Lewis finished second in his heat, qualifying for the final. As he climbed out of his cart, his smile lit up the track. During the break before the final, Omar watched Lewis study the other drivers, memorizing their lines, spotting their weaknesses. Most 10-year-olds would be playing or chatting with friends. Lewis was working. The final race was even more impressive. Starting from the middle of the pack, Lewis picked off his competitors one by one. His moves were clean and precise. Nothing flashy, just perfectly executed racing. When he took the lead with 2 laps to go, Omar found himself holding his breath. Anthony gripped the fence so hard his knuckles turned white. Lewis crossed the finish line first, a full cart length ahead of second place. That's my boy, Anthony shouted, rushing to the track. Omar watched from a distance as father and son embraced. He didn't need to intrude on their moment, but as they walked back toward the pits, Lewis spotted him. Mr. Griffiths, did you see? The boy was bouncing with excitement. I saw, Omar replied, grinning. That was proper racing. Lewis beamed at the praise. I'm going to be world champion someday. Omar had heard many kids say similar things, but coming from Lewis, it didn't sound like a boast. It sounded like a plan. The bell over the shop door jangled, bringing Omar back to the present. A middle-aged man in an expensive coat looked around with obvious distaste. Can I help you? Omar asked, putting away his half-eaten sandwich. Just looking, the man replied, picking up a racing glove and examining the price tag. Bit steep, isn't it? I can get these online for half the price. Omar bit back a sharp reply. This was why his shop was failing. These are professional grade, he said instead. Tested by real racers. The man put the glove down. My son's just starting out. He doesn't need professional grade. Every racer deserves proper equipment, Omar said. It was what he'd always believed. The man left without buying anything. Omar sighed and returned to his inventory. His phone rang an hour later. It was Anthony Hamilton. Omar nearly dropped the phone in surprise. They hadn't spoken in years. Anthony? Is everything all right? Just checking in, old friend, Anthony said. Heard some rumors about your shop. News traveled fast in racing circles. It's nothing, Omar lied. Just some changes coming. Lewis asks about you sometimes, Anthony said. Remembers how you helped us? Omar doubted that was true. Why would Lewis Hamilton, with his millions and mansions, spare a thought for an old shop owner from Stevenage? How is he? Omar asked. Busy. Always busy. But good. Anthony paused. "Listen, if you need anything, we're fine here," Omar said quickly. "Just some slow business, that's all." After hanging up, Omar felt his hands shaking worse than usual. He took his medication, but the tremors persisted. From stress, not Parkinson's. He remembered another day at Rye House when Lewis was 11. He'd won the British Cadet Kart Championship. McLaren's Young Driver program had taken notice. "I can't repay you yet," Anthony had told Omar after the race. "They want him to move up to junior karts. That means new equipment. Pay me when you can," Omar had said. "That boy's going places." In 1998, Lewis had signed with McLaren. Omar had watched the news with pride. The shop phone rang, jolting Omar from his memories. "Mr. Griffiths, it's your landlord. We need to discuss your moving date. The developers want to start demolition next month." Omar felt his stomach drop. "We agreed on 30 days. "Plans change," Mr. Patel said coldly. "I need you out in 2 weeks." After hanging up, Omar looked around at his life's work. 2 weeks to pack up 30 years. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows like tiny racing heartbeats. Omar watched the raindrops race down the glass, each one carving its own path. Some were fast, some slow. Some joined together to become stronger. Like racers, he thought. Like Lewis. The early 2000s had been good years for both Lewis and the shop. While Lewis moved up through Formula Renault, Omar's little business had thrived. Parents brought their kids in, asking, "Is it true Lewis Hamilton used to shop here?" Omar would smile and tell them stories. Yes, Lewis had stood right there, trying, on his first proper racing helmet. Yes, that was the corner where he'd studied racing magazines while his dad talked about equipment. Those glory days seemed far away now. Omar closed the shop early and climbed the stairs to his flat. He'd need boxes. Lots of boxes. How did you pack 30 years into cardboard? He pulled out an old photo album from his bookshelf. Inside were pictures from 2003, when Lewis was dominating Formula Renault. Omar had traveled to a few races, watching, from general admission, just another face in the crowd. Lewis had been 18 then, no longer the wide-eyed boy from Stevenage. He was McLaren's golden boy, moving up through racing's ranks exactly as planned. Omar remembered a rare visit Lewis had made to the shop that year. He'd been home between races and had stopped by with Anthony. "Got any racing gloves?" Lewis had asked, looking around the familiar shop. "The ones McLaren gives us are too stiff." Omar had brought out several pairs. As Lewis tried them on, Omar had noticed how much his hands had changed. Stronger now, a racer's hands. "You ever make it to any of my races, Mr. Griffiths?" Lewis had asked. "A few," Omar had admitted. "You're doing brilliantly." Lewis had smiled that million-watt smile. "Still got a long way to go. Formula One's the goal." "You'll get there," Omar had said with certainty. Lewis had left with 3 pairs of gloves and a promise. "When I make it to F1, I'll get you paddock passes. You can come see me race properly." By 2005, Lewis was in Formula 3. The shop was beginning to struggle as big chain stores opened nearby. They could buy in bulk and offer lower prices than Omar could match. Each month, the books showed less profit. Omar started using his savings to keep the shop afloat. His first missed mortgage payment came that winter, then another. The bank sent warnings that he ignored. Omar's phone rang, jarring him from his memories. He didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Mr. Griffiths? It's Maya, from the shop. My dad says you're closing down." Omar sighed. News traveled fast in small towns. Yes, love, afraid so. But where will we get our racing stuff? Dad says no one knows karts like you do. Her concern touched him. There are plenty of shops online now, better prices too. It's not the same, Maya insisted. When you helped me adjust my seat position, I shaved 2 seconds off my lap time. You can't get that from a website. After they hung up, Omar returned to his packing. He found an old magazine with Lewis on the cover, holding a Formula 3 trophy. Aloft. The headline read, "Hamilton, the next British champion?" Omar remembered watching the Formula 3 championship that year on his small television. Lewis had been unstoppable, winning race after race. The day before Lewis left for the final race weekend, he'd visited the shop one last time. Nervous? Omar had asked. Lewis had shaken his head. Ready, he'd replied simply. Omar had wanted to tell him about the shop's problems, about the missed mortgage payments, about how online sales were killing his business. But looking at the focused young man before him, he couldn't bring himself to add to his burdens. You'll be in Formula 1. Next, Omar had said instead. Lewis had nodded. That's the plan. And when I make it, I won't forget the people who helped me get there. Omar had believed him. Why wouldn't he? Lewis had always been grateful, always acknowledged the help he'd received. But fame changed people. Success created distance. As Lewis climbed higher in the racing world, the gap between them had widened. The last time Omar had seen Lewis in person was 2006, just before his Formula 1 debut was announced. He'd come to Stevenage for some event and had stopped by the shop briefly. "It's happening, Mr. Griffiths," he'd said, eyes bright with excitement. "McLaren's giving me a seat next season. Formula 1. "You deserve it, lad," Omar had replied, genuinely happy for him. "Your dad must be over the moon." "He is. We all are." Lewis had looked around the shop. Place hasn't changed a bit. But it had. The shelves weren't as full. The new equipment orders were smaller. The racing world was changing, and Omar's little shop was being left behind. Lewis had left that day with promises to stay in touch, to send tickets, to remember the shop that had helped him start his journey. Omar had never received any tickets. No calls had come. Lewis Hamilton had become a global superstar, and Omar Griffiths had become just another memory from his past. Omar didn't blame him. Why would a Formula 1 driver look back? Life moved as fast as the cars they drove. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows. Omar's hands shook as he placed the magazine back in its box. His Parkinson's was worse in damp weather. His doctor had suggested medications that might help more, but they weren't covered by the NHS. "Too expensive," Omar had told him. "I'll manage with what I've got." The truth was, Omar could barely afford his rent, let alone fancy new medicines. The shop was losing money every month. His savings were nearly gone. And now, 2 weeks to find a new home. 2 weeks to dismantle the life he'd built. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his landlord. "Developers coming tomorrow to measure the space. Please allow them access." Omar texted back a simple, "Okay," and set the phone down. Outside, his window across the street, a new sports equipment chain store blazed with light. Their windows advertised lowest prices guaranteed and official F1 merchandise. Inside one of those windows was a life-sized cardboard cutout of Lewis Hamilton, smiling in his Mercedes racing suit, surrounded by expensive merchandise bearing his name and face. Omar watched as people hurried through the rain to shop there, walking past his small store without a glance. The next morning, Omar woke to the sound of his alarm. For a moment, he forgot about the eviction notice. Then reality crashed back, heavy as a broken engine. He dressed slowly, his fingers struggling with the buttons on his shirt. The tremors were worse today. He swallowed his pills with a glass of water and waited for them to take effect. Downstairs, he unlocked the shop and switched on the lights. The familiar smell of rubber, oil, and leather wrapped around him like an old friend. Omar turned on the small television behind the counter. It was always tuned to a sports channel these days. If he was lucky, they might show some Formula One news. He wasn't disappointed. There was Lewis, stepping out of a private jet in Melbourne, Australia. The first race of the 2007 season was just days away. Lewis Hamilton, the first black driver in Formula One, was making headlines worldwide. McLaren's rookie sensation Lewis. Hamilton arrives for his debut Grand Prix, the announcer said. The 22-year-old from Stevenage has been with the McLaren program since he was 13. Omar smiled sadly. They never mentioned the years before McLaren, the struggle, the sacrifice, the help Lewis had needed just to get noticed. In his heart, Omar knew he was being unfair. Lewis didn't owe him anything. The loans had been repaid years ago. The discounted equipment was business, not charity. Still, a paddock pass would have been nice. A chance to see from the inside the world he'd helped Lewis reach. The bell above. The door rang. The developers had arrived. 2 men in expensive suits carrying tablets and measuring tapes. "Mr. Griffiths?" "We won't be long," one said, barely looking at Omar. "Just need some measurements for the demolition plans." Omar watched, silently as they moved around his shop, discussing where walls would be knocked down, where new fixtures would go. They talked as if he wasn't there, as if his life's work was already gone. When they left, Omar locked the door behind them and put up the closed sign. He couldn't face customers today. Instead, he went to the back room where he kept his oldest, racing memorabilia. Things too outdated to sell, but too precious to throw away. There was his own racing helmet from the 1970s, dented on one side from the crash that had ended his driving career. Next to it, a stack of trophies from local races, small victories in a small life. Omar had never made it past amateur racing. Not enough money, not enough talent, not enough luck. All the things Lewis Hamilton had in abundance, he'd opened. The shop after his crash, turning his passion into a business. For years, it had been enough. He'd been happy helping other racers chase their dreams. Omar sat heavily on an old stool, suddenly overwhelmed by memories. He remembered the day his wife had left him, tired of competing with his racing obsession. He remembered the night he'd stayed up until dawn, working on his race car instead of attending his father's birthday dinner. So many sacrifices for a dream that had never quite materialized. Then Lewis had walked into his shop, and Omar had seen a second chance. A way to be part of racing greatness, even if only from a distance. His phone rang. It was his doctor. "Mr. Griffiths, you missed your appointment yesterday?" Omar had forgotten completely. "Sorry, Doc. Been a bit distracted." "Your Parkinson's won't wait for a more convenient time," the doctor said gently. "How are the tremors?" "Manageable," Omar lied. "And the new symptoms we discussed? Any trouble walking? Changes in your voice?" Omar thought about how he'd stumbled twice that morning. How customers sometimes asked him to repeat himself because his words slurred. "Nothing serious," he said. The doctor sighed. "You need to consider that treatment I mentioned. It could significantly improve your quality of life." "Can't afford it," Omar said simply. "Shop's not doing well." After hanging up, Omar returned to the television. They were interviewing Lewis now, asking about his expectations for his first Formula One race. I'm just grateful for the opportunity," Lewis was saying. "So many people helped me get here. My dad, Ron Dennis, McLaren, Omar. Didn't expect to hear his name. Why would Lewis mention a small shop owner from Stevenage when talking to the world's press? Still, a tiny part of him hoped. The list of thank yous continued. Team bosses, engineers, sponsors. The thanks went on and on, but Omar's name never came. It was silly to feel hurt. Lewis probably barely remembered him now. The weekend arrived, and with it, Lewis's first Formula One race. Omar watched every minute, from practice to qualifying to the race itself. Lewis finished third, a podium in his very first Grand Prix. The commentators couldn't stop talking about this amazing new talent. Omar felt a strange mix of pride and loss. Pride in seeing the boy he'd helped succeed beyond all expectations. Loss because that success had taken Lewis to a world Omar would never be part of. As the season continued, Lewis kept surprising everyone. He stood on the podium race after race. He challenged his teammate, a two-time world champion. He nearly won the championship in his rookie year. Omar watched it all from his shop, surrounded by going out of business signs he'd finally put up. Each race weekend brought fewer customers as word spread that Griffith's Racing Supplies was closing. Maya still came by, her father buying parts they didn't really need, out of kindness more than necessity. "Why don't you contact Lewis Hamilton?" Maya asked one day. "Tell him what's happening. He could help." Omar shook his head. "He's busy becoming a champion. Besides, that was all a long time ago." "But you helped him," Maya insisted. "You said so yourself." "I gave his dad some loans, that's all. He paid them back. But it had been more than money. It had been belief. It had been seeing potential when others saw only a black kid from a council. A state with impossible dreams." As Omar packed up his shop, box by box, Lewis Hamilton became the talk of Formula One. By the end of 2007, he had come within 1 point of winning the World Championship as a rookie. Omar watched the final race alone. In his flat, the shop below empty except for the heaviest fixtures. He'd sold most of his stock at a loss. The rest he'd given away to young racers who couldn't afford new equipment. Next year, Omar told the television as Lewis gave an interview after losing the championship by the smallest margin. "You'll win it next year." And in his heart, Omar knew it was true. Lewis Hamilton was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, Omar Griffiths was destined for what? A small flat somewhere, living on a pension that would barely cover rent? A life watching racing on television instead of being part of it? The rain had stopped. Outside, stars peeked through breaking clouds. Omar stepped onto his small balcony, looking up at the vast sky. Somewhere in Brazil, Lewis Hamilton was probably looking at the same stars, surrounded by team members, sponsors, and fans. Their worlds couldn't be further apart now. The 2008 Formula One season began with Omar in a new reality. The shop was gone. He'd found a small flat across town, much cheaper than his old place, but also much smaller. Most of his racing memorabilia remained in boxes. There was no room to display it. Omar followed Lewis's season religiously. He'd canceled his cable TV to save money, but he'd kept his internet connection. He watched races on his laptop, the screen, too small to capture the grandeur of Formula One, but enough to follow Lewis's progress. By October, it was clear the championship would come down to the final race, again in Brazil. Lewis versus Felipe Massa of Ferrari. He needs 5th place, or better to win the title, Omar explained to Maya, who had stopped by with her father to check on him. They were his only regular visitors. You should have a watch party, Maya suggested, like you used to do at the shop. Omar hesitated. His new flat was tiny and shabby. He was embarrassed to have people over. "Please?" Maya begged. "Dad says it's not the same watching races without your commentary." So Omar agreed. He cleaned his flat as best he could, hiding the medical pamphlets about Parkinson's, making sure his pill bottles were out of sight. He bought cheap snacks and soft drinks he couldn't really afford. On race day, Maya arrived with her father and 3 other young racers Omar had helped over the years. They crowded into his small living room, eyes fixed on the laptop Omar had connected to a borrowed monitor. "Lewis looks nervous," one of the kids said, as the camera showed Hamilton preparing for the race. "He's focused," Omar corrected. "There's a difference." The race was pure drama. Rain began falling just before the start. Wet races were unpredictable, dangerous. "This helps Lewis," Omar told his guests. "He's magic in the rain." The race unfolded like a Hollywood movie. Lead changes, strategy gambles, mistakes, and brilliant recoveries. With 3 laps to go, Lewis was in 5th place, just enough to win the championship. Then disaster struck. Another driver passed him, pushing Lewis to 6th. "No!" Everyone in Omar's living room shouted at once. "It's not over," Omar said, but his voice shook. "Never give up until the checkered flag." On the final lap, with rain falling harder, Lewis was still 6th. Felipe Massa crossed the finish line in 1st place. The Ferrari team began celebrating their driver's championship. Then, in the final corners of the final lap, Lewis made a desperate move. He passed Timo Glock, moving back to 5th place, enough to win the championship by a single point. The room erupted. Maya and her friends jumped up and down, screaming. Maya's father hugged Omar so hard it hurt his fragile frame. "He did it!" Maya shouted. "He's world champion!" Omar felt tears on his cheeks. The skinny boy from Stevenage, the son of an ambitious father who'd worked 3 jobs, the kid who'd needed loans to buy racing gear. That boy was now on top of the racing world. On screen, Lewis was crying too, overcome with emotion. His father hugged him tight. The cameras showed them walking together, arms around each other, through a crowd of celebrating team members. "I helped make that happen," Omar said softly, so quietly no one else heard. "In some small way, I helped make that happen." After everyone left, Omar sat alone, watching the celebrations continue. Lewis was given the championship trophy, holding it high above his head. "I want to thank my family," Lewis said during his speech. "My dad, who sacrificed everything. My team, who believed in me. And everyone who helped us when times were tough." Omar wondered if, somewhere in Lewis's mind, he was included in that last group. Probably not. There had been many people who helped the Hamiltons. Omar was just one of many, and not the most important. The next morning, Omar checked his bank account. The shop's final bills had been paid, leaving his balance dangerously low. His next pension payment wouldn't arrive for 2 weeks. He looked up at the small shelf where he'd placed Lewis's childhood trophy, the only piece of memorabilia he'd unpacked. A reminder of better days. Omar's landlord called that afternoon. "Rents going up next month," he said without preamble. "New rates for all tenants." "How much?" Omar asked, dreading the answer. The figure made his heart sink. It was more than his pension would cover. Even with his small savings, he'd run out of money within a few months. "I can't pay that," he said simply. "Then I'll need you out by the end of the month," the landlord replied. "Got a waiting list of people who can pay." Omar sat heavily on his worn sofa after hanging up. Another eviction. Another move. To where? Even cheaper flats meant worse neighborhoods, further from the shops, harder for someone with his condition to manage. He picked up Lewis's trophy, turning it over in his trembling hands. The engraving was simple. Lewis Hamilton, Cadet Kart, Champion. The date was from 15 years ago. A lifetime? Omar had a thought. The trophy might be worth something now. There were collectors who paid good money for memorabilia connected to champions. No, he said aloud, putting the trophy back on its shelf. Not yet. Instead, he took his old racing watch to a pawn shop. It had been a gift from his father when Omar started racing. The shopkeeper offered him far less than it was worth, but Omar accepted without argument. That night, he packed a single suitcase with his most essential belongings. The rest he would have to leave behind if he couldn't find an affordable place. Soon. On television, Lewis Hamilton was everywhere. Talk shows, news programs, advertisements. The handsome young champion with his million-dollar smile was Britain's newest hero. Omar watched him being interviewed, speaking confidently about his journey. I always believed I could do it, Lewis was saying, even when others doubted. Omar nodded. That was true. Lewis had never lacked belief in himself. And my dad made sure I had what I needed to succeed, Lewis continued. He worked multiple jobs to buy my racing equipment. Omar didn't expect Lewis to mention the loans, the discounts, the times when Anthony Hamilton had been short on cash, and Omar had helped them make it to the next race. Why would he? Those were small details in a much bigger story. But as Omar looked around his tiny flat, at the boxes he would soon have to pack again, at the medical bills he couldn't pay, at the eviction notice on his table, those small details felt very large indeed. Years passed. Omar moved twice more, each flat smaller than the last. His Parkinson's worsened despite the medications he could afford. The tremors spread from his hands to his arms. Walking became more difficult. Some days were better than others, but the good days grew fewer. Through it all, Omar followed Lewis, Hamilton's career. He watched as Lewis left McLaren for Mercedes in 2013, a move many experts called a mistake. Mercedes hadn't won a championship in decades, but Lewis proved them wrong. By 2014, Mercedes had built a car that dominated Formula One. Lewis won his second world championship that year, and then a third in 2015 and a fourth in 2016. Omar tracked every race, every victory, every milestone. He kept a scrapbook of newspaper, clippings about Lewis, adding to it whenever he could afford to buy a paper. From his small flat in a forgotten corner of Stevenage, Omar watched Lewis become not just a champion, but a global superstar. There he was at fashion shows in Paris, at movie premieres in Hollywood, at royal events with princes and dukes. The racing world that had once been Omar's whole life now seemed as distant as the moon. He couldn't afford to attend races anymore, not even the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, just a couple of hours away. Omar's new flat was in a run-down building with thin walls and unreliable heating. His neighbors were mostly immigrants and elderly people on fixed incomes like himself. People the world had pushed to the margins. One cold January morning in 2017, Omar found another eviction notice slipped under his door. The building had been sold to developers. They planned to tear it down and build luxury apartments. Not again, Omar whispered, his voice shaking as much as his hands. He sat at his small kitchen table, the eviction notice before him, and for the first time in years, he considered reaching out to Lewis. What would he say? Remember me. I helped you buy tires 20 years ago. Now I need help. The thought made him sick with shame. Lewis didn't owe him anything. The loans had been repaid. The help had been freely given. Besides, Lewis wouldn't even remember him now. Why would he? The world's most successful Formula One driver had bigger things to think about than an old shop owner from his childhood. Still, as Omar looked at the eviction, notice, he wondered. Lewis was worth hundreds of millions now. He owned houses around the world. He had a private jet. He dated famous singers and actresses. Surely he could spare a little help for someone who had helped him when he needed it most. Omar found an old business card from a McLaren team member who had visited his shop years ago, looking for vintage racing memorabilia. The number probably didn't work anymore, but it was a start. Before he could dial, Omar's phone rang. It was Maya. "Mr. Griffiths, are you watching? Lewis is on BBC One right now, talking about his charity work." Omar fumbled for the remote, turning on his small television. There was Lewis, looking elegant in a tailored suit, sitting across from a morning show host. "You've established a foundation to help underprivileged children get into motorsport," the host was saying. "Why is that important to you?" Lewis smiled that perfect smile. "Because I know how hard it is to break into racing without money. My dad worked multiple jobs to support my career. We struggled for years. If not for the people who believed in me, I wouldn't be here today." "Like Ron Dennis of McLaren, who famously supported you from a young age," the host prompted. "Ron was incredibly important, yes, but even before him, there were people in my community who helped us. Small kindnesses that made a huge difference." Omar felt his heart beat faster. Was Lewis talking about him? "Can you give an example?" the host asked. Lewis thought for a moment. "There was this local mechanic who would fix our cart for free sometimes, when we couldn't afford repairs. People like that, who saw a kid with a dream and decided to help." Omar's heart sank. Lewis was talking about someone else. Of course he was. Many people had helped the Hamiltons over the years. After the interview, Omar looked again at the eviction notice. 30 days to find a new place. With his condition worsening and his pension barely covering food and medicine, where would he go? He thought about his wife, who had left him 25 years ago. "Racing will never love you back," she had said as she packed her bags. She had been right. Omar had given his life to racing. First as a driver, then as a shop owner, and finally as a spectator. What had he received in return? A body that betrayed him. A business that failed. A future that looked emptier with each passing day. That afternoon, Omar ventured out to the corner shop for milk and bread. The January wind cut through his thin coat. His legs moved stiffly, each step an effort. The shopkeeper, Mr. Patel, greeted him warmly. "Morning, Mr. Griffiths. Cold one today, eh?" "Morning," Omar replied, his voice softer and more slurred than it once had been. Another symptom of his progressing disease. "You see the news about the old Griffiths Racing building?" Mr. Patel asked, as he rang up Omar's purchases. Omar shook his head. "They're knocking it down next week. Luxury flats going up." Mr. Patel shook his head. "Whole town is changing." Omar paid for his groceries and shuffled back to his flat. He took a detour, walking past his old shop building one last time. The windows were boarded up. The sign was long gone. Nothing remained to show that for 30 years, this had been Griffiths Racing Supplies, that champions had walked through its doors, that dreams had been supported within its walls. Omar stood there until his legs ached too much to continue. As he turned to leave, a young woman approached, carrying a professional camera. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Omar Griffiths?" Omar blinked in surprise. No one had asked for him by name in years. "I am," he replied cautiously. "I'm Diane, from the Stevenage Gazette. I'm doing a piece on the redevelopment of this area." She gestured tawdry to the shop. "I understand this was your business for many years?" Omar nodded. "And is it true that Lewis Hamilton used to shop here as a boy?" "Yes," Omar said, feeling a strange pride break through his gloom. "He did. His father, too. Would you be willing to share some memories for my article? Local boy makes good, that sort of thing?" Omar hesitated. What good would it do to talk about the past? Lewis had moved on. Stevenage had moved on. The world had moved on. Yet as he looked at the eager young reporter, Omar felt a small spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Importance, relevance, a connection to a world that had left him behind. "I have a few stories," Omar said quietly, "if you'd like to hear them." The reporter, Diane, smiled warmly. "I'd love to hear them. Is there somewhere we could talk? It's freezing out here." They ended up at a small cafe across the street. Omar ordered tea he couldn't really afford, wrapping his trembling hands around the warm cup. For the next hour, Omar shared his memories of young Lewis and Anthony Hamilton. He told Diane about the loans, the discounted equipment, the times he'd traveled to watch Lewis race. He showed her the few photos he carried in his wallet, faded snapshots of a skinny boy with a determined smile standing next to his cart. "So, you were one of the first people to believe in him?" Diane asked, scribbling notes. "One of many," Omar corrected. "His father believed in him most of all. I just helped where I could." "Have you stayed in touch with Lewis?" Omar looked down at his tea. "No, he's very busy these days." "But surely he remembers your help. You must have been an important part of his early career." Omar shrugged. "People move on. It was a long time ago." When they finished, Diane thanked him and promised to send him a copy of the article when it was published. Omar gave her his address, not mentioning that he would likely be evicted before the story ran. Walking home, Omar felt lighter than he had in years. Talking about those days had brought back good memories. The pride he'd felt watching Lewis win. The satisfaction of knowing he'd helped in some small way. But as he climbed the stairs to his flat, reality settled back on his shoulders. The eviction notice was still on his table. His medication was running low. His future was still a blank. Inside, Omar found a small package that had been delivered while he was out. Opening it, he found an old thank you card from Lewis, dating back to his Formula 3 days. Omar had thought it lost in one of his many moves. To Mr. Griffiths, it read, in Lewis's neat handwriting, "Thank you for always believing in me. One day, I'll pay you back by becoming champion. Lewis." Omar traced the words with his finger. Lewis had kept that promise many times over. He was a 7-time world champion now, tying the great Michael Schumacher's record. Looking at the card, Omar made a decision. He would write to Lewis. Not asking for help, he couldn't bring himself to do that, but just to reconnect, to say he was proud of what Lewis had accomplished. Omar spent hours drafting the letter, his handwriting made uneven by his tremors. He told Lewis about watching every race, about keeping a scrapbook of his achievements, about how proud he was to have played some small role in Lewis's journey. He didn't mention his health problems or financial troubles. He didn't want Lewis to feel obligated or guilty. He just wanted to reach out one last time, to bridge the gap that had grown between them. When he finished, Omar read the letter over. It was simple, honest, heartfelt. He addressed an envelope to the McLaren Technology Center. the only address. He had that might reach Lewis, even though Lewis had left the team years ago. But as Omar prepared to seal the envelope, doubt crept in. Would Lewis even remember him? Would the letter seem pathetic? A desperate grab for attention from someone long forgotten? Would it reach Lewis at all, or be thrown away by some assistant who had never heard of Omar Griffiths? In the end, Omar placed the letter in his bedside drawer. Maybe tomorrow, he told himself. The next day, Omar woke to the sound of breaking glass. Looking out his window, he saw 3 teenagers running away from his building. His heart sank. Downstairs, he found his worst fears confirmed. The shop on the ground floor had been vandalized, windows smashed, shelves knocked over, and the damage hadn't stopped there. The thugs had broken into the building's entryway, smashing mailboxes and spraying graffiti on the walls. Mr. Sony, who owned the small convenience store that had been attacked, stood amid the wreckage, his face pale with shock. "Third time this year," he told Omar. "Insurance won't cover it anymore. I can't afford to fix this." "I'm sorry," Omar said, knowing the words were inadequate. He helped Mr. Sony clean up as best he could, though bending to pick up broken glass sent pain shooting through his stiff back. That afternoon, Maya visited, bringing a homemade meal as she sometimes did. At 16, she was becoming a promising racer herself, competing in junior tournaments across the county. "You won't believe it, Mr. Griffiths," she said excitedly as she unpacked the food. "Dad's taking me to Silverstone for the British Grand Prix this summer. We might even get paddock passes through his work." "That's wonderful," Omar said, genuinely happy for her. Maya set out plates on Omar's small table, carefully moving aside. "The eviction notice. What's this?" she asked, her smile fading as she read it. "Just another move," Omar said lightly. "Nothing to worry about." But Maya wasn't fooled. "This says you have to be out in 3 weeks. Where will you go?" Omar had no answer. He'd contacted social services, but the waiting list for assisted housing was long. His pension wouldn't cover market rents anywhere in town. "I'll figure something out," he said. "Always do." After dinner, as Maya prepared to leave, she noticed Lewis's childhood trophy on the shelf. "Is that really his?" she asked, eyes wide. Omar nodded. "His first championship trophy. His dad gave it to me as thanks for some help I gave them." "It must be worth a lot now," Maya said. "Lewis Hamilton memorabilia sells for crazy prices online." The thought had occurred to Omar too. The trophy might fetch enough to cover a deposit on a new flat, but it was the only tangible connection he had left to those days. "Not for sale," he said firmly. After Maya left, Omar found himself drawn to his laptop. He rarely used it, his trembling hands made typing difficult, but now he opened a browser and searched for Lewis Hamilton Foundation. The official website appeared, showing Lewis surrounded by smiling children. The foundation's mission statement talked about breaking down barriers in motorsport, helping underprivileged youth access racing opportunities. There was a Contact Us button. Omar's cursor hovered over it. Would Lewis's charity help someone who had once helped Lewis? Or would Omar's message be lost among thousands of requests? Before he could decide, his landlord knocked on the door. "Mr. Griffiths, the building's been vandalized again," he said without greeting. "Insurance premiums are going up for everyone. I'll need an extra £50 with your next rent payment." "I can't pay that," Omar said. "I can barely pay the current rent." The landlord's face hardened. "Then you should start packing now instead of waiting for the eviction date. I've got people who will pay what the flat is worth." After the landlord left, Omar sat heavily on his sofa, suddenly overwhelmed. The room seemed to spin around him, his chest tight with anxiety. He reached for his phone to call his doctor, but his trembling hands betrayed him. The phone clattered to the floor as Omar felt a crushing pain in his chest. He tried to stand, to reach the phone, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. As darkness closed in, Omar's last thought was of Lewis, raising a championship trophy high above his head, fulfilling the promise of that determined boy from Stevenage. Beeping machines. The EBE smell of disinfectant. Hushed voices. Omar opened his eyes to blinding white lights. A hospital room. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "Mr. Griffiths, can you hear me?" A nurse stood beside his bed, checking monitors. "What happened?" Omar's voice came out as a croak. "You had a heart attack," the nurse explained. "Your neighbor heard you fall and called an ambulance. You're lucky to be alive." Omar closed his eyes. Lucky wasn't the word he would have chosen. "How long have I been here?" 3 days. You've had a visitor waiting most of that time. I'll tell her you're awake." Minutes later, Maya rushed in, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Griffiths, you scared us so badly." She took his hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. "Sorry about that." Omar managed a weak smile. "Didn't mean to cause trouble." "Trouble? Mr. Sony found you on the floor. If he hadn't been checking on everyone after the vandalism..." Omar squeezed her hand. "I'm all right now." But he wasn't all right. The doctor came later to explain that Omar had suffered a minor heart attack, likely brought on by stress and his existing health issues. He would need new medications, more rest, better care, all things that cost money he didn't have. "We'll keep you for observation a few more days," the doctor said. "Then you can go home." Home. Omar nearly laughed. He might not have a home to return. Maya visited every day, bringing small gifts, magazines about racing, homemade food that tasted better than the hospital meals, a hand-knitted scarf. "I've been thinking," she said on the 3rd day, sitting beside his bed. "What if we told people about you? About how you helped Lewis Hamilton?" "Told who?" Omar asked. "Everyone. I put something on social media already about my racing mentor, being in hospital, the man who helped Lewis Hamilton start his career." Omar frowned. "Maya, that's not necessary. I don't want charity." "It's not charity. It's recognition. You deserve it." Before Omar could argue further, a nurse entered. "Mr. Griffiths, you had another visitor yesterday while you were sleeping. She said she'd come back today." "She?" Omar couldn't imagine who else would visit him. An hour later, his question was answered when Diane from the Stevenage Gazette appeared at his door. "Mr. Griffiths, I'm so sorry to hear about your health troubles." She held up a newspaper. "I wanted to bring you this. My article was published yesterday." Omar took the paper with trembling hands. There on the local news page was a headline: "The man who helped launch Lewis Hamilton's career." Diane had written a good piece. It told the story of Griffiths Racing Supplies and how Omar had provided loans and equipment to the Hamilton family when Lewis was just starting out. It mentioned Anthony's determination, Lewis's natural talent, and Omar's belief in them both. "It's been getting a lot of attention online," Diane said. "People are sharing it on social media. Maya's post about you being in hospital has been shared. Hundreds of times, too." Omar didn't know what to say. He'd lived in quiet obscurity for so long. The idea of people talking about him was uncomfortable. "Have you seen the comments?" Maya asked, pulling out her phone. "People are saying Lewis should know about this, that he should help." "No," Omar said firmly. "I don't want that. Lewis doesn't owe me anything." But the story was already spreading beyond their control. By that evening, a local TV news crew had contacted the hospital requesting an interview. Omar refused. "I didn't help that boy for recognition," he told Maya. "I did it because he had talent and determination." The next morning, a nurse brought Omar his medication and a business card. "Someone came by very early this morning to see you, but you were having tests done. They left this." Omar looked at the card, his heart skipping a beat. Mercedes AMG F1. Below it, a name he didn't recognize and a phone number. Did they say who they were? Omar asked. "Just that they were from Mercedes. Said they'd come back later." Omar stared at the card long after the nurse had gone. Mercedes. Lewis's team. Had Lewis seen the article? Had he sent someone to check on Omar? Maya arrived later, buzzing with excitement. "The story's gone national. It's in The Guardian and the BBC website. Lewis Hamilton's forgotten mentor. That's what they're calling. You?" Omar grimaced. "I was never his mentor. Just someone who helped a bit." "Well, people are loving the story. There's a hashtag trending. Remember your roots." Omar closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. This attention was the last thing he wanted. What would Lewis think? That Omar was using their past connection for fame? For money? "Maya, please. No more posts. No interviews. But Mr. Griffiths, this could help you. People want to help." She hesitated. "I started a fundraising page for your medical bills. It's already raised over £1,000. Omar felt a wave of shame wash over him. Charity. Handouts. Is this what his life had come to? "Take it down," he said quietly. "Please. But it's my life, Maya. My pride. Please respect that." Maya looked hurt, but she nodded. That afternoon, while Maya was getting coffee, a well-dressed woman entered Omar's room. "Mr. Griffiths, I'm Sarah Jenkins, from Mercedes AMG Formula One." She was the name on the business card. "Do you feel up to a short conversation?" Omar nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "I'll be direct. We've become aware of the recent articles about your connection to Lewis Hamilton. Lewis is preparing for the British Grand Prix next week, and this story is gaining traction in the media. We'd like to understand more about your history with him." Her tone was professional, neither warm nor cold. Omar couldn't tell if she was there to help him or to manage a potential public relations issue. "There's not much to tell," Omar said. "I owned a racing shop. I helped Anthony and Lewis with equipment when they needed it. Lewis became a champion. End of story." Sarah took notes on her tablet. "And you've had no contact with Lewis in recent years?" "None. The articles suggest you're facing eviction and health problems. Is that accurate?" Omar looked away. "My personal situation isn't Lewis's concern." Sarah studied him for a moment. "Mr. Griffiths, I appreciate your discretion. Many people in your position would be using this connection differently." Before Omar could respond, Maya returned with coffee. She stopped short when she saw Sarah. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you had a visitor." Sarah stood. "I was just leaving. Thank you for your time, Mr. Griffiths." She handed him another business card. "If you think of anything else, please call me directly." After she left, Maya bombarded Omar with questions. Who was she? What did she want? Was Lewis coming to visit? "She was just gathering information," Omar said. "Don't get your hopes up." But as Omar drifted off to sleep that night, the business card on his bedside table, he couldn't help wondering, did Lewis remember him at all? Omar was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. The doctor gave him prescriptions he couldn't afford and instructions for rest he couldn't follow. He had 2 weeks left before his eviction, and nowhere to go. Maya's father, Mr. Patel, drove him home. "You'll stay with us until you find a new place," Mr. Patel said firmly as they approached Omar's building. "Maya's already made up the spare room." "I couldn't impose," Omar protested weakly. "It's not imposing when it's family," Mr. Patel replied. "And that's what you are to us." Omar felt a lump in his throat. Family. He'd been alone for so long, he'd almost forgotten what that word meant. As they pulled up to his building, Omar saw a small crowd gathered outside. People with cameras, a news van. "What's this?" Mr. Patel muttered. A reporter spotted them and rushed over. Others followed. "Mr. Griffiths, can we get a statement about Lewis Hamilton? Is it true you're being evicted? Has Lewis contacted you? Yet?" Mr. Patel honked his horn, forcing the reporters to step back. "Let us through! He's just come from the hospital." Somehow they made it inside. Omar's legs shook as he climbed the stairs to his flat. The attention was overwhelming. Inside, Omar found his few possessions being packed into boxes by his landlord. "What are you doing?" Mr. Patel demanded. The landlord barely looked up. "Eviction's happening today. Court order came through while he was in hospital." "That's illegal." Mr. Patel pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my solicitor." "Call whoever you want," the landlord said, tossing Omar's books into a box. "I've got developers waiting to start demolition. They've paid extra to speed things up." Omar leaned against the wall, suddenly dizzy. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not when he was still so weak. "Where's Lewis's trophy?" he asked, looking around frantically. The landlord pointed to a box by the door. "Sports stuff is in there." Omar rushed to check. The trophy was there, wrapped in a t-shirt. He clutched it to his chest like a lifeline. Outside, the reporters were still waiting. Someone had tipped them off about the eviction. In progress. As Omar's possessions were carried out and placed on the pavement, cameras flashed and questions flew. "This is disgusting," Maya said, arriving to find Omar sitting on a chair among his belongings. "They're treating you like this while Lewis Hamilton lives in mansions?" "It's not Lewis's fault," Omar said tiredly. "He could help if he wanted to. One word from him, and you'd have somewhere to live." Maya took out her phone and began filming. Everyone needs to see this. The man who helped. Lewis Hamilton is being thrown onto the street. Omar was too exhausted to argue. He sat amid the ruins of his life as Maya's video captured his humiliation for all to see. The media stayed all day, filming as Omar's possessions were loaded into Mr. Patel's car and a friend's van. By evening, news websites were running the story with headlines like "Hamilton's Forgotten Helper Homeless" and "Racing Legend Evicted While F1 Star Earns Millions." At the Patel's home, Omar was given a small but comfortable bedroom. Maya showed him her laptop, where her video of the eviction had been viewed over 100,000 times in just hours. "People are outraged," she said. "They're calling for Lewis to help." Omar shook his head. "This isn't fair to him. He doesn't even know me anymore." The next morning, sports journalists began calling the Patel's home. How they'd found the number, Omar couldn't guess. Mr. Patel unplugged the phone. "This will die down," he assured Omar. "News cycles are short these days." But the story didn't die down. Instead, it grew. A well-known sports presenter did a segment on the forgotten heroes who helped champions reach the top. Omar's story was featured prominently. Social media exploded with the hashtag #HelpOmarGriffiths Omar Griffiths alongside "Remember Your Roots." People shared old photos of Omar's shop, stories from other racers he'd helped, calls for Lewis to do the right thing. Through it all, Omar remained quiet. He refused interviews. He wouldn't bash Lewis. When reporters cornered him outside the Patels' home, he would only say, "Lewis Hamilton worked incredibly hard for his success. His father made enormous sacrifices. I was just one of many who helped along the way." 5 days after the eviction, the story reached its peak. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone was that weekend, and journalists were asking Lewis about Omar during the pre-race press conference. Omar watched it live on television, his stomach in knots. "Lewis, there's been a lot of social media attention on Omar Griffiths, who claims to have helped your family in your early racing days. He's recently been evicted and is having health problems. Have you been in contact with him?" Lewis frowned, looking genuinely confused. "Omar Griffiths? I'm not sure who that is, to be honest. So many people helped us when I was starting out," the journalist pressed. "He owned a racing supply shop in Stevenage. He says he loaned your father money for your equipment." Lewis shook his head. "That was a long time ago. I'd have to ask my dad about it. But like I said, many people helped. Us." Omar switched off the television, his heart heavy. As he'd suspected, he'd been just one of many, too insignificant to remember. Maya was furious. How could he forget? After all you did. It was 25 years ago, Omar reminded her. He was just a child. But the damage was done. On social media, fans turned against Lewis, calling him ungrateful, privileged, forgetful of his roots. The story was no longer about Omar's hardship, but about Lewis's apparent betrayal. That evening, Omar's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Omar Griffiths?" A man's voice, familiar somehow. "Yes. Who's this?" "It's Anthony Hamilton, Lewis's father." Omar nearly dropped the phone. "Anthony? It's been too long," Anthony finished. "I just saw the news. Omar, I'm so sorry about what's happening." "It's not your fault," Omar said automatically. "Lewis didn't mean any harm. He was 9, 10 years old when you helped us. He remembers the shop, but names, you know how it is." Omar did know. Children rarely remembered the names of adults who helped them. Why would they? "I've reminded him," Anthony continued. "The tires for the championship. The clutch at Rye House. He remembers now." Omar felt a warmth spread through his chest. "He doesn't need to do anything, Anthony. I didn't help expecting payback." "I know that. That's why your help meant so much." Anthony paused. "Lewis wants to make this right. You'll be hearing from his team." After they hung up, Omar sat holding his phone, emotions washing over him in waves. Not hope for financial help, though that would be welcome, but something more valuable. The knowledge that he hadn't been forgotten after all. Maya found him there, still clutching the phone, tears on his cheeks. "Mr. Griffiths, are you okay?" Omar nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, he told her about Anthony's call. "So Lewis does remember." Maya punched the air triumphantly. "I knew he couldn't be that cold." "He was a child," Omar reminded her. "Children don't remember every adult who helps them." Maya wasn't satisfied. "He should have remembered. You're part of his story." A small part, Omar thought. A few pages in a book filled with bigger characters. Ron Dennis, McLaren, Mercedes, the great champions Lewis had raced against. The next morning, Omar woke feeling worse than usual. The stress of recent days had taken its toll. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his teacup. His chest felt tight. Walking to the bathroom left him breathless. Mr. Patel noticed immediately. "I'm taking you back to the hospital," he said firmly. Omar tried to protest but lacked the strength. At the hospital, Doctors found his blood pressure dangerously high and admitted him immediately. "Your heart can't take this stress," the doctor told him. "You need rest, proper medication, and a stable living situation." Easy to prescribe, Omar thought. Impossible to fill. From his hospital bed, Omar watched as British Grand Prix practice sessions began at Silverstone. Lewis was fastest in both sessions. The commentators mentioned the controversy about Omar, but focused mainly on Lewis's chances for victory at his home race. Maya visited after school, bringing news from the outside world. "The social media campaign is getting bigger," she said. "Sports journalists are digging into your story. They found other people who remember you helping young racers." "I helped whoever I could," Omar said weakly. "There's going to be a protest at Silverstone. Fans holding signs about remembering roots and helping you." Omar shook his head. "That's not right. Lewis doesn't deserve that at his home race." But there was no stopping it now. The story had taken on a life of its own. People loved the narrative. Forgotten hero who helped a champion, now abandoned in his time of need. That evening, Sarah Jenkins from Mercedes called. "Mr. Griffiths, I want to update you on the situation. Lewis will be addressing this issue at tomorrow's post-qualifying press conference. Is there anything you'd like him to know beforehand?" Omar thought carefully. "Tell him I never wanted this. Attention. I'm proud of what he's accomplished. And whatever he says, I'll understand." After hanging up, Omar felt his chest tightening again. The nurse noticed his monitors changing and called for the doctor. They gave him medication to stabilize his condition, but warned that his heart was weakening. "You can't keep going through these stress cycles," the doctor warned. "Your heart won't take it." The next day was qualifying at Silverstone. Omar watched from his hospital bed as Lewis fought for pole position. The Mercedes driver missed it by 1/10 of a second, settling for second on the grid. In the post-qualifying press conference, a journalist inevitably raised the topic of Omar. "Lewis, there are fans outside with signs supporting Omar Griffiths. Your comments yesterday seemed to suggest you didn't remember him. Has your position changed?" Lewis looked uncomfortable. "I've spoken with my father about this. Mr. Griffiths owned a shop in Stevenage where we bought equipment. Dad reminded me that he helped us with some loans when we were short on money. That was a long time ago, when I was a kid. Will you be helping him now that you know he's in need?" Lewis frowned. "I think a person's charitable decisions should be private. I don't discuss who I help or how much." The answer came across as defensive. On social media, the backlash intensified. Fans called Lewis arrogant, ungrateful, out of touch with his roots. Omar was heartbroken watching it unfold. This wasn't what he wanted. Not at all. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone and recorded a video message. "My name is Omar Griffiths," he began, his voice weaker than he'd like. "I'm the person from the news stories about Lewis Hamilton. I want to make something very clear. Lewis doesn't owe me anything. He and his father repaid every loan I gave them. My current situation is not their responsibility." He paused, gathering strength. Lewis Hamilton earned every bit of his success through talent and hard work. His father made incredible sacrifices. I was just one of dozens of people who helped, in small ways. Please stop attacking Lewis. He deserves your support, not your criticism, especially at his home race. Omar sent the video to Maya, asking her to share it online. Within hours, the video spread across social media. Sports news channels played it. People began sharing it with the hashtag #JambarOmarSpeaks. The narrative shifted. Now people praised Omar's dignity and class. Some still criticized Lewis, but many appreciated Omar's perspective. By race day morning, Omar's condition had worsened. The doctors spoke in hushed tones outside his room. His heart was failing, weakened by years of stress and poor health care. They could stabilize him for now, but long-term prospects weren't good. Maya and her father arrived to watch the race with him. They pretended not to notice how pale Omar looked, how his breathing had become labored. "Lewis might win today," Maya said brightly. "The Mercedes looks fast," Omar smiled weakly. "He's always magic at Silverstone." The race began with Lewis losing a position at the start, dropping to third. Omar watched intently, forgetting his own troubles as the drama unfolded on track. By mid-race, Lewis had fought back to second place. The cameras showed fans in the grandstands, some holding signs that read, "Remember your roots," and "Support Omar," but fewer than expected. Then something unexpected happened. As Lewis's car flashed past the pits, viewers could see something written on his helmet, just above the visor. The commentator noticed it. "It appears Lewis Hamilton has added something to his helmet today. Can we get a closer shot?" "Yes, there it appears to say, 'For OG.' I wonder what that means." Omar's heart skipped a beat. OG, his initials. Maya squeezed his hand. "He remembered," she whispered. "He remembered," Omar echoed, tears welling in his eyes. With 10 laps to go, Lewis caught the leader and passed him with a brilliant move into Cop's Corner. The British crowd erupted in cheers as their hero took the lead. Lewis won the race by 5 seconds, a dominant victory at his home Grand Prix. Omar watched the celebrations through tears of joy and pride. During the podium ceremony, after the national anthem played, Lewis took the microphone. "I want to dedicate this win to someone who believed in me when I was just a kid with a dream," he said, his voice carrying across Silverstone and to televisions worldwide. "Omar Griffiths, this one's for you." In his hospital room, Omar couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too big, the tears flowing too freely. Maya hugged him carefully, mindful of the tubes and wires. "He remembered," Omar whispered again. The moment played on every sports channel throughout the evening. Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, dedicating his British Grand Prix victory to a forgotten shop owner from Stevenage. Social media exploded with the story. People searched for information about Omar. The video he'd recorded defending Lewis went viral again, shared hundreds of thousands of times. Omar was too weak to follow it all. The doctors increased his medication, trying to stabilize his condition. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes dreaming of racetracks and checkered flags. In the morning, he woke to find Mr. Patel sitting beside his bed, reading a newspaper. "You're famous," Mr. Patel said with a smile, showing Omar the front page. There was Lewis on the podium, and beside it, an old photo of Omar's shop. The headline read, "Champion remembers his roots." Omar shook his head weakly. "Never wanted fame." "Sometimes it finds you anyway," Mr. Patel replied. Later that day, Dr. Williams came to check on Omar. His expression was grave as he studied the test results. "Your heart is very weak, Mr. Griffiths," he said gently. "We're doing everything we pretty can, but you need to prepare yourself." Omar nodded. He'd suspected as much. His body had been failing him for years. "How long?" he asked. "Hard to say. Could be months, could be less." The doctor hesitated. "Is there anything you want to do? Anyone you want to see?" Omar thought about it. "I'd like to go to Silverstone one last time," he said. "But I suppose that's not possible now," Dr. Williams made a note. "Let me see what I can do." That afternoon, Omar drifted into memories of his first visit to Silverstone. It had been 1992. Lewis had been 7 years old, too young to race, but already obsessed with Formula One. Omar had offered to take him and Anthony to watch the British Grand Prix. He needs to see where he's headed, Omar had told Anthony. Dream big or go home. They'd sat in the cheapest seats, high in the grandstands, but Lewis hadn't cared. His eyes had been fixed on the cars, his small body vibrating with excitement. "That's going to be me one day," Lewis had said confidently, pointing at the McLaren of Ayrton Senna as it flashed past. Omar and Anthony had exchanged glances over the boy's head. Dream big indeed. "What team will you drive for?" Omar had asked. "McLaren," Lewis had replied without hesitation. "They have the best cars." It had seemed impossible then. A black kid from a council estate in Stevenage, dreaming of driving for McLaren. Yet, just 15 years later, that impossible dream had come true. Omar was jolted from his memories by a nurse entering his room. "Mr. Griffiths, there's someone here to see you. She says she's from Mercedes again." Sarah Jenkins entered, carrying a large gift basket and a folder. "Mr. Griffiths, how are you feeling?" Her tone was warmer than during their first meeting. "I've been better," Omar replied with a weak smile. Sarah set the basket down. "Lewis wanted me to deliver this personally, and to tell you he's sorry he can't be here himself." The team flew straight to Hungary for the next race. Omar nodded. He hadn't expected Lewis to visit. Why would he? Lewis lived in a world of private. Jets and luxury hotels. Hospital visits to old men weren't part of that world. "The basket is lovely. Please thank him for me." "There's more," Sarah said, opening her folder. "Lewis and the team have been working on something." She handed Omar an envelope. "This is for you." Inside was a letter on Mercedes team stationery. It explained that the team had partnered with a healthcare provider to cover all of Omar's medical expenses, present and future. They had also arranged for him to move into a comfortable assisted living facility once he was stable enough to leave the hospital. "This is too much," Omar protested, overwhelmed by the generosity. "There's one more thing," Sarah continued. "Dr. Williams tells us you'd like to visit Silverstone one last time." Omar nodded, confused by the change of subject. "Lewis would like to invite you to the Mercedes factory in Brackley. It's not far from Silverstone. Once you're well enough, of course. He wants to thank you personally." Omar couldn't find words. The world's most successful Formula One driver wanted to meet him. To thank him? I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Sarah smiled. "Lewis is quite insistent." After she left, Omar lay back on his pillows, trying to process everything. The financial help was a relief, of course. No more worrying about medical bills or housing. But the invitation to meet Lewis, that was beyond anything he'd imagined. Maya visited after school, bringing more news from the outside world. "You're trending again," she said excitedly. Lewis gave an interview after the race. He told the whole story about how you helped his family. He said he was confused when first asked because he knew you as Mr. Griffiths when he was a kid, not Omar. She showed Omar a video clip on her phone. There was Lewis, still in his racing suit, speaking to a reporter. "When I was 9, 10 years old, Mr. Griffiths owned a shop in Stevenage where we bought racing equipment," Lewis was saying. "There were times when we couldn't afford new tires or parts, and he would help us out. My dad reminded me of specific times, like when we needed a clutch repair before a crucial race, and Mr. Griffiths not only loaned us the money, but came to help fix it." Lewis paused, looking directly into the camera. "I want to apologize to Mr. Griffiths for not recognizing his name immediately. It was over 25 years ago, and I was a child, but I never forgot the kindness even if I didn't remember every name. There were many people who helped us along the way, and I'm grateful to all of them. Omar watched the clip 3 times, tears in his eyes. It was more acknowledgement than he'd ever expected or wanted. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Omar's doctors worked with specialists hired by Mercedes. His medication was adjusted. His condition stabilized, though remained serious. Gifts and cards poured in from racing fans around the world. Maya helped Omar read them all, touched by the outpouring of support from strangers. One card stood out, a simple handwritten note from Anthony Hamilton. "Some debts can't be repaid with money," it read. "Thank you for believing in my son when others didn't. You saw what I saw in him. I never forgot." Omar kept the card on his bedside table, reading it often. A week after the British Grand Prix, Dr. Williams entered with good news. "You're stable enough for a short trip," he said. "If you still want to visit Silverstone," Omar's heart leaped. "More than anything." "Mercedes has arranged everything. An ambulance will take you tomorrow. A medical team will accompany you. It's only approved for a few hours. But it's enough," Omar said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "More than enough." The next morning, Omar was carefully transferred to an ambulance. Maya insisted on coming along. The medical team included a doctor and 2 nurses, all briefed on Omar's condition. "We'll be taking it very slowly," the doctor explained, "and at the first sign of any problems, we turn back. Understood?" Omar nodded. He felt stronger today than he had in weeks. Perhaps it was the excitement, perhaps the new medications. Either way, he was determined to make this journey. As the ambulance pulled away from the hospital, Omar gazed out the window at the passing scenery. English summer in full bloom, green fields, hedgerows dotted with wildflowers, villages with ancient churches. "You're smiling," Maya noted. "Just enjoying the view," Omar replied. "Been a while since I've been out of Stevenage." The drive to Silverstone took nearly 2 hours with the ambulance moving carefully. As they approached the famous circuit, Omar felt his heart beat faster, this time with excitement, not the worrying rhythm of his illness. But they didn't stop at the main entrance. Instead, the ambulance turned off toward a collection of modern buildings nearby. "That's the Mercedes factory," Maya explained, reading Omar's confused expression. "In Brackley, just a few miles from the circuit." The ambulance passed through a security gate and pulled up outside a gleaming glass and steel building with the Mercedes star prominently displayed. Sarah Jenkins was waiting for them, along with a team of people wearing Mercedes uniforms. "Mr. Griffiths, welcome," she said, as the medical team helped Omar into a wheelchair. "Lewis is very excited to meet you." Omar felt suddenly nervous. What would he say to Lewis Hamilton? Would Lewis remember him at all from those early days, or only what his father had told him? They wheeled him into a reception area filled with Formula One cars from different eras, a museum of Mercedes racing history. Omar stared in wonder at the machines, each one representing millions of pounds of engineering excellence. "Lewis will join us shortly," Sarah explained. "He's just finishing a simulator session. In the meantime, would you like a tour?" Omar nodded, eagerly. Maya walked beside his wheelchair as they were shown through the factory, the engineering departments, the carbon fiber workshop, the engine room. Everywhere, people stopped to greet Omar, many saying they'd heard his story. "Lewis mentioned you in our team meeting," one engineer told him. "Said we should all remember the people who help us on our journey." Finally, they were led to a conference room overlooking the factory floor. A table was set with tea and sandwiches. The medical team positioned Omar's wheelchair at the head of the table and checked his vital signs. "Holding up well," the doctor murmured, sounding slightly surprised. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it and smiled. "He's on his way." Omar straightened in his wheelchair, suddenly wishing he'd worn something nicer than the simple button-down shirt and slacks the hospital had provided. Maya squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. The door opened, and Lewis Hamilton walked in. He looked different in person than on television, smaller somehow, but with an unmistakable presence. He wore a team shirt with his number 44, jeans, and stylish trainers. His smile was exactly as Omar remembered from all those years ago. Wide, genuine, lighting up his entire face. "Mr. Griffiths," Lewis said, crossing the room quickly. "It's so good to see you." Omar extended a trembling hand, but Lewis ignored it and bent to give him a gentle hug instead. "Thank you for coming," Lewis said, pulling back to look Omar in the face. "I know it wasn't easy with your health." "Wouldn't have missed it," Omar replied, finding his voice. Lewis turned to greet Maya, then sat down across from Omar. "I want to apologize properly," Lewis began. "When they first asked me about you at the press conference, I didn't connect the name Omar with Mr. Griffiths from the shop. It was stupid of me." "You were a child," Omar said. "No need to remember the name of every adult." "But you weren't just any adult," Lewis insisted. "After my dad called me, it all came flooding back. The shop, the loans. That time you fixed our clutch at Rye House." Lewis shook his head. "I should have remembered sooner." "It was a long time ago," Omar said. "Not that long," Lewis smiled. "I've still got that trophy, you know. My first cadet championship. Dad told me you kept the matching one." Omar nodded. "It's at the Patels' house now. All my things are." A shadow crossed Lewis's face. "I heard about the eviction. That should never have happened." He leaned forward. "I want to help. Mr. Griffiths, whatever you need. Medical care, housing, anything." "Mercedes has been very generous already," Omar said. "That's the team. This is from me," Lewis said firmly. "You helped me when I needed it most. Let me return the favor." Omar felt tears threatening. He blinked them back. "I never helped expecting anything in return." "I know. That's what makes it special." Lewis paused. "Dad told me everything. How you believed in me before most people did. How you gave us credit when banks wouldn't. Those loans might seem small now, but they meant everything then." They talked for almost an hour. Lewis asked about Omar's life, his health, his memories of the shop. He listened intently, asking questions, laughing at stories about young Lewis that he'd forgotten. "You were so determined," Omar recalled. "Even at 9, you knew exactly what you wanted." "Still do," Lewis grinned. When the medical team indicated it was time for Omar to rest, Lewis had one more surprise. "I promised you paddock passes once," Lewis said. "Remember? When I made it to F1, I said you could come see me race properly." Omar remembered. It had been a casual promise made by a teenager, never fulfilled. "Better late than never," Lewis continued. "The team has arranged something special." Outside, a Mercedes road car was waiting. With the medical team's approval, they helped Omar inside. Lewis sat beside him as they drove the short distance to Silverstone. "No race today," Lewis explained, "but the track is open for some private testing, and I thought you might like to see it from a different perspective than last time. You were here." They entered through a VIP gate and drove directly to the pit lane. There, gleaming in the summer sun, was Lewis's Formula One car. The mechanics stood around it, waiting. "What's happening?" Omar asked, confused. Lewis smiled. "You're going to sit in it." With gentle care, the mechanics and medical team helped Omar. from the car and over to the Formula One machine. Lowering him into the tight cockpit was difficult, but they managed it. Omar sat there, surrounded by the complex steering wheel, the pedals at his feet, the car that had won so many championships. "How does it feel?" Lewis asked. "Like a dream," Omar whispered. They took photos. Omar in the car, Lewis standing beside it. Then more photos with the entire Mercedes team gathered around. Everyone wanted to meet the man who had helped Lewis. Hamilton start his journey. As they prepared to leave, Lewis had one final surprise. He handed Omar a small box. "This is for you," he said. Inside was a perfect replica of Lewis's helmet, reduced to palm size, with signatures from Lewis and the entire team, and inscribed on the back, "To Omar Griffiths, who believed before others saw. Thank you, Lewis." "Hamilton." "I'll treasure it," Omar said, his voice thick with emotion. On the drive back to the hospital, Omar felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. The day had been perfect, better than he could have imagined. "Worth the wait?" Maya asked quietly. Omar nodded, clutching the miniature helmet. "More than worth it." 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new beginnings for Omar, as well as nature. The assisted living facility arranged by Mercedes was more like a luxury apartment than a care home. Omar had his own spacious flat, with a balcony overlooking gardens. The walls were decorated with framed photos of Lewis Hamilton's career and memorabilia from Omar's shop days. His health had stabilized, not improved, the doctors were careful to explain, but not deteriorating as rapidly as before. The new medications and better care had given him more time, more good days among the bad. 3 times a week, Omar traveled to the Lewis Hamilton Foundation offices nearby, where he worked part-time as a mentor to young racers from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation had been established shortly after the Silverstone visit, with Omar consulted on its mission and operation. "We want to find the next Lewis Hamilton," the foundation director had explained, "and who better to help than someone who spotted the first one?" Omar's role was simple: talk to the kids, share his knowledge of racing, help identify true talent and determination. It wasn't physically demanding, which suited his condition, but it gave him purpose again. Maya had been one of the first young racers accepted into the program. At 17, she showed real promise in Formula 4, the entry level to professional, open-wheel racing. The foundation covered her racing costs, while Omar provided technical advice and encouragement. On a sunny April morning, Omar sat in his favorite armchair, reading the racing news on his tablet. Lewis had won the first 2 races of the new Formula One season and was leading the championship again. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. It was his caregiver, Susan. "You have visitors, Mr. Griffiths. Shall I show them in?" Omar nodded, setting aside his tablet. He expected Maya and her father. They often visited on Saturdays. Instead, Lewis Hamilton walked in, followed by Anthony. "Surprise inspection," Lewis grinned. "Making sure they're taking good care of you." Omar struggled to stand, but Lewis waved him back down. "Don't get up on my account. We're just dropping by on our way somewhere." Anthony looked around the flat, nodding approvingly. "Nice place. Better than that old flat above the shop." "Much better," Omar agreed. "How are you, Anthony? Still managing Lewis's schedule?" Anthony laughed. "Not for years. He's got people for that now. I just enjoy watching him race these days." They chatted about the new F1 season, about Maya's progress in the foundation program, about old times in Stevenage. It felt natural, comfortable. 3 men connected by a shared past, a mutual respect. "Actually, we're here for a reason," Lewis said eventually. "We'd like you to come with us. There's something I want to show you." "Today?" Omar asked, surprised. If you're up to it, Lewis said. I've checked with your doctors. They say a few hours out won't hurt, as long as you take it easy. Curious, Omar agreed. Susan helped him prepare, making sure he had his medications and a warm coat. Outside, a sleek Mercedes waited. Lewis helped Omar into the back seat, then got behind the wheel himself. Anthony sat in the passenger seat. Where are we going? Omar asked as they pulled away. Stevenage, Lewis replied, catching Omar's eye in the rearview mirror. Going home. The drive was pleasant, with Lewis and Anthony sharing stories from Lewis's racing career, the victories, the defeats, the behind-the-scenes, moments fans never saw. As they entered Stevenage, Omar felt a pang of nostalgia. The town had changed in the months since he'd left. New buildings, new shops, the inevitable march of progress. Lewis drove to a familiar street and parked. Omar looked out the window, confused. They were outside the site of his old shop. The building had been demolished, as he'd known it would be. In its place was a construction site nearly completed. What's this? Omar asked, as Lewis helped him from the car. Your legacy, Lewis replied simply. As they approached the site, a construction manager hurried over, clearly expecting them. He led them to where they could see the nearly finished building safely. We're on schedule, the manager told Lewis. Opening in 6 weeks, as planned. The building was modern, but tasteful, with large windows and a sleek design. On the front, in large letters, was a sign, Griffith's Racing Academy. Omar stared, unable to speak. I bought the property, Lewis explained. When I heard they were demolishing your old shop, it felt wrong. This place was important, to me, to other young racers. So I decided to build something new, something that would carry on what you started. A racing academy? Omar finally managed. Lewis nodded. For kids who can't afford normal racing schools. We'll provide equipment, training, everything they need. The foundation will run it, but I wanted it to have your name. I don't know what to say, Omar stammered. You don't need to say anything, Lewis replied. This isn't charity, it's recognition. Your shop helped launch my career. This academy will launch others. They stood together, watching workers putting finishing touches on the building. Omar tried to process the magnitude of what Lewis had done. Not just helping one old man with medical bills and housing, but creating something lasting, something that would help generations of young racers. There's one more thing, Lewis said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Omar. Inside was a check for £2,000. What's this for? Omar asked, confused by the specific amount. It's a repayment, Lewis explained. The first loan you gave my dad, £2,000 for tires and a clutch. But it's not going to you. No? It's the first donation to a new scholarship fund. The Omar Griffiths Scholarship. For a young racer who shows the same promise you saw in me. Omar felt tears on his cheeks, but made no move to wipe them away. The symbolism was perfect. The original loan that had helped launch Lewis's career, now helping to launch someone else's. Maya will be the first recipient, Anthony added. Lewis and I thought you'd approve. Omar nodded, too emotional to speak. As they stood there, Lewis received a text message. He checked it and smiled. They're ready for us at the track, he said. Track? Omar questioned. Rye House Kart Circuit, where it all began. Maya's testing today, and I thought you might like to watch. An hour later, Omar sat beside the track, where Lewis had won his first championships. The spring sun warmed his face as he watched Maya navigate the circuit in a professional racing cart, her lines smooth and confident. Louis stood behind Omar's wheelchair, occasionally offering commentary on Maya's technique. "She's good," Louis said. "Really good. Reminds me of myself at that age." "She has the same hunger," Omar agreed. "The same focus." They watched in comfortable silence as Maya completed her test session. When she pulled into the pits, she waved excitedly at Omar and Louis. "That's what it's all about," Louis said quietly. "Passing it on. Making sure the next generation gets their chance." Omar looked up at the man beside him, no longer the skinny boy from his shop, but a champion who had never forgotten where he came from. "You've done well, Louis," Omar said. "Not just the championships. This, remembering your roots, helping others up the ladder. That's the real victory." Louis placed a hand on Omar's shoulder. "I had good teachers," he said simply. As Maya ran over to get their feedback on her driving, Omar felt a profound sense of completion. His life had come full circle. The boy he had helped was now helping others, including himself. The shop was gone, but something better would stand in its place. And most importantly, the connection remained, that invisible thread binding those who believe in dreams, who see potential in others, who understand that true success isn't measured in trophies but in lives touched and opportunities created. That, Omar realized, was worth more than any repaid loan or championship trophy. That was his real legacy, and that was the end of our story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional journey about kindness coming full circle, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Together, we can spread kindness and awareness about how small acts of generosity can change lives and create lasting legacies. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.